Change is coming, isn't it? And I think it's pretty clear that even though we are in opposition now, the Labour Party is setting the political agenda. If you'd have said a few short years ago that Theresa May would announce the lifting of the cap on local authorities to encourage them to start building council houses, you'd have said that was an impossibility. And yet we see that very statement being made by Theresa May at the Tory party conference. Now, of course, it remains to be seen how it actually works out in practice. But what is great is that at long last, after 4 decades of a neoliberal consensus, which I've got to say, regrettably, infected New Labour as well, we do now offer the British people a genuine choice. And I say there's never been an easier time to campaign for the Labour Party, because the vast majority of the public agree with us. Now, you might say, well, why aren't we further ahead in the opinion polls? And I've got a few theories about that, and I won't necessarily go through them all tonight, but things like a coup and some of the difficulties that we still have with people who are inside the party, I think, does create some difficulties for us. And of course, we do have the adverse media, as we know. But I'm absolutely convinced that we are going to win this next general election. And we're going to see Labour returning MPs in seats where we would have never thought that was possible. I mean, I go all over the country now, and it's great to go into places where Labour's never really had a footprint before. And now we have a situation where we've got vibrant political parties in every corner of our country. And we are therefore going to win very easily, in my opinion, some of those seats. So Watford, with a majority of 2,000, is it? Chris Oskowski, is it? The candidate here is, I think, going to be joining me, I hope, if I'm reselected as the candidate on those green benches and standing up for the people of Watford. And long overdue, in my opinion, that Watford has another Labour MP here. So I want to talk this evening about democracy, though, and the importance of democracy. And some might say that's a little bit navel contemplation, but the point is, as Tony Benn once said, we have to democratise our party in order to democratise society. And he's absolutely right about that. We have to get our structures in a right place so that we are in a good position then to actually make the changes that the people are crying out for. As I say, there's never been an easier time to campaign for the Labour Party when you've got 70 or 80%, sometimes above 80% actually, when you look at some of the policy positions that we've got now, are actually supported by the British public. 83% want to see the water industry brought back into public ownership. Democratic control over our water industry. Democratic control over our other utilities, our Royal Mail, the railways. These are things that the people are crying out for. I was talking to one Labour MP. He said he was on the train back to Luton, Kelvin Hopkins, and he was saying that it was crushed like this. And he's saying people were really fed up. And somebody shouted, "Nationalisation without compensation." And he said the carriage burst into spontaneous applause. A bit like, as Dave was saying, when people make those impromptu speeches in the restaurants that you're talking about, in the campaign that you're involved with. So there's a real appetite now for that approach. But the thing is, the sort of public ownership that we are putting forward now is very different to the model that we put in place in 1945. Now, I want us to recapture that spirit of 1945. And indeed, Ken Loach made a film, didn't he, about the spirit of 1945. But what we're talking about is democratizing our economy, democratizing the way in which we deliver those services in a way that people really feel a genuine connection to. So rather than a top-down statist approach, we're talking very much about a bottom-up approach. So the sense of municipalization, cooperatives, so that people really feel a connection to the services that are being provided. That has got to be a cornerstone, I think, of the agenda that we go into the next election with. And indeed, will be a cornerstone of that programme going forward. And people talked about our manifesto, the last manifesto, which was a great manifesto. Some has described it as the best manifesto since 1945. There's been some really good manifestos, I think, in the intervening years. But one thing which was very different about this manifesto is, compared to other manifestos, is that it really spoke to millions of people. I've never known people, I don't know how many people have knocked regularly on doors in this room, talk about the manifesto on the doorstep. Our manifesto has almost become a bestseller. You know, it's in its 5th print run. People can't get enough of them. I was at a fundraising dinner for a constituency in the East Midlands region, and I had a manifesto. I made the point, this isn't just any old manifesto. This is going to be a family heirloom that will be handed down from generation to generation. And it has the added benefit of having Jeremy's signature in it. And it went from £100 to £150 to £200 to £250 to £270 for that manifesto. People were really inspired, I think, by the manifesto that we put forward at the last general election. And the next manifesto will be better because we had to pull that together in double quick time. But I think the key point I'm trying to make is the importance of democracy and reaching out and making sure that we are relevant to the wider general public. And to be in a great position where you've got policies that you can be proud to speak about on the doorstep, where you haven't got to draw a veil over certain areas of our policy agenda. We've got a policy agenda now of scrapping tuition fees, of talked about bringing the utilities into public ownership, investing in our public services, clamping down on the tax evaders, making sure that we have an industrial strategy that's fit for purpose, the right to own, probably the most radical proposition in the manifesto. So that when a hedge fund comes along and wants to asset strip a company and offshore the jobs to low-wage economies, and that's been a massive feature of our economy. When I left school in Derby in 1972, 120,000 people worked in manufacturing in Derby. It's a fraction of that today. 35,000 people alone worked in Rolls-Royce. Most of those jobs have gone overseas. Some have been lost, yes, to automation. But that right to own will mean that when a hedge fund comes along, you'll think there's rich pickings, and we can make a fast buck by asset stripping the company. They will not be able to do that because the workers will be given the first right of refusal to buy that company out. And it's not just a theoretical right either, because it will be underpinned with the National Investment Bank. And so the finance will be there, and an agency will be around as well to help the workers do the necessary legals and the financials associated with actually creating a new company in order to develop a network of worker cooperatives in our country. And we'll be able to give form to the vision that Tony Benn was setting out in the 1970s of genuine industrial democracy. And we've talked, haven't we, recently at conference about giving workers shares in companies. And absolutely right too, because it's the hard work of ordinary workers, isn't it, that actually generates the profits for the companies. And so of course they should have a stake, and of course they should have a shareholding in the companies for whom they work and make the profits for. So we're going to rebalance our economy. There will be, as we talked about in the 1974 manifesto, an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in this country. And with a leader like Jeremy Corbyn and a shadow chancellor who will be the chancellor like John McDonnell, we will definitely make it happen. But the democracy that's contained within the Labour Party is going to be key to a lot of that. Now, we had the democracy review, didn't we? And that was a great opportunity. And a lot of discussions took place. They had tens of thousands, I believe it was, submissions to the democracy review for ideas that were being put forward. Some of them got through, others didn't. And so therefore, I think we need to continue to make the case for greater democracy inside our party. Yes, we've made some progress, but nowhere near enough. The changes that were made, for example, to the way in which we elect our leader, I don't think were, I wouldn't say they were unhelpful, but they certainly didn't, in my opinion, reflect the wishes of the vast majority of the party members. And in my opinion, I'm an MP, but I don't actually think that MPs should be the gatekeepers to the ballot paper to determine who will be the leader of our party. Because the point I make over and over and over again is the PLP is not the Labour Party. Now, I know the media like to sort of talk about the Labour Party as being concentrated and based in Westminster, but it's not. It's not. You are the Labour Party. Hundreds of thousands of people up and down this country are the Labour Party. And the PLP, yes, it's an important component of the Labour Party, but it's less than 0.04% of the Labour Party. So they ain't the Labour Party. So why should MPs be the determining factor as to who can get on the ballot paper? It's just not right. We only got Jeremy on the ballot paper by default because some MPs who describe themselves subsequently as morons decided to lend their vote, lend their nomination, should I say, to Jeremy to get him on the ballot paper. They wish they didn't. But the genie's out the bottle now, isn't it? And one of the things I want to say, just in relation to the way in which we nominate our leader, some were arguing, people like Richard Bergen and others, and there were submissions on it. I would actually remove MPs from it altogether. Others were less dramatic than that, and they said, no, what we should have is an or situation. So, and the proposition was, although it didn't come through, but I think it's something we should continue to press for, 5% of MPs, and it's 10% at the moment, but 5% of MPs, or 5% of affiliated trade unions, or 5% of constituency Labour parties. Now, what we agreed is that we'll keep the threshold at 10%, and we'll add 5% of CLPs or 5% of trade unions. Now, yes, it's better, and we already had the 10% because we've already been reduced from 15%. But if you'd written a screenplay about Jeremy's journey onto the ballot paper, you would have said it would never happen in real life. Because it was literally seconds to go, literally. There was a minute left to the deadline, and they rushed in with the last 2 nominations to get onto the ballot paper. And then we saw what happened. John McDonnell was his campaign organiser. He organised a room a bit like this. And have you seen the film Jaws? Where the shark appears and he turns and says, we're going to need a bigger boat. Well, John was saying, we're going to need a bigger meeting room because people were turning up in their hundreds. And obviously in the second leadership election after the coup, they're turning up in their thousands. We couldn't find rooms big enough. We had to have open air meetings, literally open air meetings, because we couldn't find rooms that were big enough to accommodate the support. So what has been unleashed is huge energy and enthusiasm and commitment and determination. And I've never witnessed anything like it. I've been in, despite my youthful appearance, the Labour Party for 42 years. And I've never seen a time when the Labour Party has been so engaged, so determined, so enthused to actually deliver a Labour government up and down the country, north, west, east, south. It's the same wherever I go. People are really determined to make a difference because they can see that what we're offering now is giving hope to people, is offering a genuine alternative to people. And that's what is really engaging people and bringing them into our movement. And we've got to do better to bring more people in. And I'll talk a little bit about that if I get time a little bit later on. But one of the things that Jeremy was keen to see is widening the way in which we make democracy, the way in which we make policy in our party. And regrettably, there was proposition and there was hope and expectation that the Democracy Review would recommend this, but it never actually made the final cut when it went through the previous NEC. But the idea was that we would be able to embrace new technology. Digital democracy, we have an opportunity, don't we, to involve every single member in our movement, in our policy-making process. Now, I know some people in Parliament who are trapped in the bubble, the Westminster bubble. You can see them floating around. They're trying to get out and they can't. And it affects their mind. And they think that somehow they're on an elevated plane, that only they are the custodians of common sense, of what is possible. And they feel that they have to speak hard truths to the members. But the reality is, it is the other way around. Because as Ed Miliband himself once said, if we'd trusted our members when we were in government from 1997 to 2010, we wouldn't have made as many mistakes. He's not wrong there, is he? Because if we'd listened to our members, we wouldn't have gone into an illegal war in Iraq, would we? We wouldn't have introduced tuition fees, would we? We wouldn't have cut benefits for the poorest people in our country, would we? We wouldn't have done any of those things, and others besides. We'd have certainly clamped down on the grotesque tax evasion much more than we did, and we certainly wouldn't have further deregulated the financial services, and we'd have built some council houses, and we'd have had a proper industrial strategy. So by listening to the members, actually, it makes us more fit for purpose, makes us more likely to win an election. And that is going to be key to winning an election, because we do now have a genuine mass movement, do we not? And it's that mass movement that will not just carry us over the threshold of number 10 with Jeremy held aloft on our shoulders. It will be that mass movement that will sustain us there when we win. Now, those of you that are a bit older in the room might remember the screenplay and the book by Chris Mullen, A Very British Coup. You remember that? Anybody seen it? It's about a radical socialist government coming to power and then being undermined systematically by the establishment. Now, we are going to get no end of dirt and crap. It won't just be cuddly toys that we'll be throwing at us, make no mistake. It'll be far more smelly than that. And we're going to have to stand together in solidarity to withstand those attacks. And I believe we can do that. The mass movement will enable us to do just that. Unlike the Very British Coup, we didn't have a mass movement of the kind that we now have in the 1980s when that came out. Nor did we have social media either. So we were able in the last election to appeal over the heads of the gutter press who constantly undermined the Labour Party. So we're in a much better place, I think, than we certainly were in the 1980s. That's for absolutely certain. And we have the policy agenda, I think, as I've already said, which will appeal to, and is indeed appealing to the overwhelming majority of the public. Our job is to kind of persuade people to actually recognise what we are putting forward is a prospectus that they agree with. But the other thing that we have to do, and one of the things that I was hoping would come through the democracy review, was a review and a revision of the way in which our regions are organised, our regional offices, because I think, you know, they could do so much more. We should be much more outwardly focused, bringing people in, community development. We are now appointing a number of community organisers up and down the country to work with communities. That's so important. Some people say to me that our route back to power is convincing Tories to vote Labour. Now, I'm not against Tories having a Damascene conversion, obviously, but I don't think that is our route back to power. Our route back to power, as I've already said, is the mass movement, but winning over people that don't vote. They are the biggest cohort in every election. And a lot of people don't feel, well, what's the point of voting? You know, they've been switched off politics. And our job is to reach out to those communities. And that can't just be done by Jeremy or parliamentarians. It's got to be done by the grassroots. And we've got to find a way of doing politics with people, not to people. And I think we've got a policy agenda now which will speak, will resonate, but we've got to find a way of getting that, communicating that message, and actually not just communicating the message, but receiving the message and refining our policy agenda. And I think giving members that opportunity to influence policy and so on, that's why I think we need to bring this back onto the agenda, will help us have a policy agenda which does reflect the anxieties, the concerns, the priorities of those marginalised and excluded communities. And we are the Labour Party, aren't we? We are the party, surely, that should be standing up for those communities. Isn't it a disgrace that in the 6th or 5th, depending on how you measure it, biggest economy in the world, that we've got people sleeping in shop doorways in every town and city in our country? What an absolute scandal is that? And so we've got to tackle that, and we've got a very clear policy agenda to do just that. But we've got to go further than that, haven't we? We've got to obviously build the houses that people need. And as a former bricklayer, I know how labour intensive the building industry is. And it also has a knock-on beneficial impact on the supply chain down the line. So there's huge kind of, synergy between building council houses, actually putting people back to work, tackling a social crisis in our country, and also reducing the social security bill. Because you could be providing a lower cost alternative to the private rented sector that successive governments have actually bought into. A housing policy that's forced people on modest and low incomes into the private rented sector. And then you end up with the story that Shiler was referring to earlier about somebody who's living in the private rented accommodation with no security of tenure, paying inflated rents as well, and just being thrown out at a whim. I mean, there was a developer in Derby, bought a block of flats last week, I think it was, or the week before. As soon as the deal had been completed, they issued eviction notice to all the tenants. Nothing could be done. There was a big public outcry. We managed to persuade them to withdraw them, but there's nothing illegal about them doing that. So the housing policy isn't fit for purpose, but by building, having a proper council house building program, we can provide a lower cost alternative to the private rented sector and be able to reduce the social security bill as well, because people would potentially be able to pay their own way, or if they did need to claim housing benefit, it would be considerably less. We're spending $25 billion on housing benefit every year in this country. It's an outrage. $10 billion going to the back pockets of private landlords, $15 billion, yes, to the public housing sector, but many of those are in the housing association sector. And when the Tories came to power in 1979, what they did was to prevent local authorities from building council houses and said housing associations with providers of social housing, new social housing, but we're going to cut the social housing grant. But don't worry, you can put the rents, you can borrow the money from the money markets and put the rents up to service the loan charges. And don't worry about the higher rents, because we'll subsidise that through housing benefit. And they've certainly been doing that over the years. And it's led to a situation where we're spending that kind of money. So if you think about it, what they've done, this party, which claims to be the custodian of the public purse, is use it to enrich private landlords and generate bankers' bonuses. Where is the media actually exposing this scandal? It's just not there, is it? Absolutely disgraceful, and we will do something about that. But we'll also regulate the private rented sector too. Give some security of tenure to private sector tenants, and put some controls over the amount of rent that can be charged as well. Now, the Tories say, when you say that, that will lead to landlord flight. They won't want to rent. I say, good. I don't want Rackman-style landlords renting homes to people on modest incomes and exploiting people. Yes, there's a place for the private rented sector, but we've got to find a better way, haven't we, of actually housing the people of this country. As I say, we are one of the richest countries in the world. There is no justification for that. So in terms of the regional officers, I think we need to be continuing to push. And there was a suggestion even that regional organisers would have to be elected by the members. And that would be a good thing, wouldn't it, in my opinion, because it would make them more in touch with party members and more likely then, I think, to be doing the sort of things where we can be supporting our constituency Labour Party, supporting political education officers, having political discussions about things like modern monetary theory and universal basic income and those sorts of issues. And that's what I think we need to therefore continue to push for. And the final area just that I wanted to speak about, there's many other areas as well, but we haven't got time to go into them all, in relation to the democracy review and what we need to push for, it didn't come through, is to democratise local governments as well. There's been a real disconnect, in my opinion. I've talked about the Westminster bubble. There's a town hall bubble. There's always been there, but I think it's been made worse. Back in the day, in my day, we used to have district parties. The district party used to be responsible for drawing up the manifesto. And then they'd hold the Labour group to account for delivering that manifesto. Now, nothing to do with the party members. It's the Labour group, the leadership that we'll write the manifesto. We might consult you, but it's our manifesto. Well, that creates a distance between the elected members, the councillors, and party members. And, again, councillors only get in there because of the hard work, don't they, of the activists on the ground. That's the really important thing to remember, I think. And so I think to reintroduce some measure of control in that way would be very beneficial over the manifesto. But also, there was a suggestion that the leader of the Labour group should be elected by the members, not just the councillors. Now, that would be an incredibly empowering proposition, I think, at a local level, and would make Labour groups and Labour leaders much more in tune with and in touch with, I think, the party members, and therefore in touch with the wider general public, and make it more easy, I think, for Labour to win elections if we were to embrace that. Now, these, are not great new ideas that I've come up with. These are ideas that come up from the grassroots. And that's what we need to be embracing. But we need to continue, in my opinion, to push for those democratic reforms within our party, because I think that will make us a much more fit for purpose. But we've also got to democratise our economy. I've talked a bit about worker cooperatives and public ownership and municipalisation, etc., workers on boards and so on. Because at the moment, most power doesn't reside in the political sphere, does it? It resides in the corporate sphere, the private sector sphere. And we've got to, in my opinion, bring some control over that. And part of that will be achieved through the municipalisation agenda and worker cooperatives and the sort of measures that I've mentioned. But it's got to be key. And if we're going to really embrace the benefits of new technology, embrace the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution, then we're going to need to democratise our political sphere more and our corporate sphere as well, because without that, I fear that we won't see those benefits. Now, I remember in the 1960s being told to get ready for the leisure generation, because by the time of the 1990s or early 2000s, we're only going to be working 15 hours a week. What happened? John Maynard Keynes said in 1930 that by 2030, people will be drowning in a sea of spare time, that we will only be working. And he cited 15 hours a week then. Now, that could have happened. And what I think we should be seeking to do is to embrace that new technology, but to make sure that it works in the interests of the many, not the few. So my message is to all of us, and somebody used the term, I'm not a Luddite. I think we should all become 21st century Luddites, because what the Luddites were calling for was for technology to be our servant, not our master. And the reason the Luddites were so upset was these were skilled artisans who had a good, skilled, secure occupation which gave them a decent or reasonable standard of living with security. And then technology came along with these automated looms, the big belts and big factories. And they said, well, we don't need you anymore. We'll screw you up and throw you in the waste paper bin. You're surplus to requirements. That is unacceptable. And that's what we've been seeing, actually, in recent times too. Technology has come along, people have been pushed out. And what kind of jobs have they been replaced with? I mean, the Tories gone about, we've created all these jobs. But look at what kind of jobs they're creating. They're insecure. Many of them are zero-hour contracts. They're low paid. People can't afford or aspire to buy their own house. They can't get a council house because we aren't building any at the moment. And I think back again to when I was a kid, 19 years of age, an apprentice bricklayer. I was earning enough money to buy a brand new 3-bedroom, semi-detached house backing onto a waterfront in a desirable village. And it was only 3 times what I was earning as an apprentice bricklayer in 1976. And I looked on Zoopla a few years ago to see how much that property had been sold for. And I think it was 2014, the last time I looked. And rather than it being 3 times what an equivalent apprentice bricklayer was earning in 2014, it was about 30 times what an apprentice bricklayer was earning. It was 10 grand. That's all I paid for it. And many of it wasn't that unusual. Many of my contemporaries did similarly in their teens, bought their own house, certainly in their early 20s. It was possible to do. And those that didn't want to buy, they could get a council house. I mean, people used to go down to the local housing office and say, well, I'm getting married or I'm leaving home. I want to put my name down. All right, okay, yeah. We'll have a property for you in about 6 weeks, a month maybe, That was how it was. And we should get back to that. And they go on about, Labour want to take us back to the 1970s. I say, come on, bring it on. Let's go back to the future. Yes, there were problems with the 1970s. Of course there were. But inequality was diminishing all the time, thanks to that 1945 Labour government. Every year from 1945 through to the late 1970s, a bigger and bigger proportion of the national income went to workers in their wage packets. It's been going in the opposite direction ever since. And the skilled jobs which have gone have been replaced by, as I say, precarious jobs, bullshit jobs to a large extent, bullshit jobs in the upper echelons as well. We could manage without the bloody stockbrokers, couldn't we? But we couldn't manage out without refuse collectors. And there's a great case study I read about where in New York, the mayor was playing hardball. The workers were going to go on strike. In fact, they went on strike. And he was saying he was going to face them down. After 6 or 7 weeks, they had to give in because rubbish was just piling up. They brought the city to a standstill. Around about the same time in Ireland, there was a strike in the banking sector. The bank clerks went on strike over some issue, And it went on for about 6 months. People didn't, people got by. I'm going to say they didn't notice it, but they managed to get by. They couldn't get by for 6 months with the refuse collectors going on strike. So, we need to be valuing certain jobs a lot more, it seems to me. We should be investing in our public services much more. And we could actually grasp the benefits of this fourth industrial revolution to ensure that we do work much fewer hours than we have been doing, and that we create a good society, and that we prepare ourselves, for lifelong learning, for our hobbies and for doing, voluntary work and all these sorts of things. And I'm also now a big convert to the universal basic income. And I'm delighted to say that John McDonnell has said that there will be a pilot for that. And that, I think, will be a good thing to give people, an independent income, that they can decide how they want to use it. There's been studies all over the world which shows that when you give people who are poor money with no strings attached, they don't waste it. They don't go and pee it up the wall or spend it on drugs. They actually change their life, turn their lives around. And if we have this universal principle, it will give people the chance to get back into education maybe without any costs. And we could, again, to quote Tony Benn, he once said that at a meeting, we should raise the school leaving age to 75. And he said, because he was a big supporter of lifelong learning. And he said a couple of weeks later, he got a letter from a disgruntled 85-year-old who said, "Why are you discriminating against me, Mr. Benn? I just graduated from the Open University. How dare you?" So he said, "I've changed my position. There should be no upper limit on lifelong learning." And we have this chance now in the fifth or sixth richest economy on earth with a common sense socialist leader of our party and a common sense socialist program going forward to actually reach out and offer people a genuine, hopeful alternative of a good and better society. And we have to keep hope alive. There's a sign out there, hope, on the wall. Me and John had a photograph taken against it. And I'll just perhaps conclude with a couple of quotes. The first of which is from The Shawshank Redemption. Anybody remember that film? Do you remember where the quote about hope in it? Andy Dufresne is saying to Red Redding that he's hopeful about the future. And Red says to Andy, he said, "Andy, hope is a very dangerous thing in here." And Andy responds and says, "No, Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." And thank God for Jeremy and John and Diane, who kept the flame of socialism burning in the dark and dismal days of New Labour when we'd really bought in to the neoliberal consensus, had we not? And it was Tony Benn who also said that there are two flames that burn in the human heart. The flame of anger against injustice and the flame of hope that we can build a better world. And we can build that better world together, comrades. We absolutely can. And what I say in these meetings is this next election isn't just about winning an election. Obviously, that's important. And we're in the process of building a movement. But it ain't just about winning any old election. This is about changing the course of history, creating a new consensus, an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power. So, comrades, you here today may have thought you've come along as members of Momentum and members of the Labour Party and thought that's it. That's not. You're not just ordinary members of the Labour Party. Comrades, you are history makers. So let's go out and make history. Thanks for listening.